The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the downtown courthouse as Celeste Washington adjusted the strap of her worn leather briefcase. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Across the plaza, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up, and out stepped her husband of 15 years, Richard Sterling, flanked by what looked like an army of expensive suits. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Here was one of the city's most powerful tech moguls, worth over $3 billion, surrounded by the most ruthless legal team money could buy. And there was Celeste, walking alone, carrying a briefcase that had seen better days, looking for all the world like David facing Goliath. The media had been circling this divorce case like vultures for months. The headlines wrote themselves, "Gold digger wife tries to take half of tech billionaire's fortune." The narrative was simple, clean, and devastating. Richard Sterling, the self-made genius who had built Sterling Industries from nothing, was being attacked by his ungrateful wife who had contributed nothing to his success but was now trying to claim everything he had worked for. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad, $50,000 and not a penny more. It seemed like an open and shut case. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The gallery was packed with reporters, industry insiders, and curious spectators who had managed to secure seats to what everyone expected would be the most one-sided legal beating in recent memory. Judge Patricia Monroe, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, called the court to order. She had seen countless divorce cases in her 30 years on the bench, but something about the energy in her courtroom today felt different. Richard's lead attorney, Martin Cross, was a legend in legal circles, a man who had never lost a high-profile divorce case. His reputation was built on his ability to dismantle opposing parties with surgical precision, leaving them with nothing but legal bills and shattered reputations. He stood up with the confidence of a man who knew he held all the winning cards. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "this case represents everything wrong with our legal system. Mrs. Sterling, and I use that name reluctantly, married my client 15 years ago when he was a struggling entrepreneur with nothing but dreams and determination. She has never held a job during their marriage, has never contributed to the business that made their lifestyle possible, and has spent the last decade and a half living in luxury while my client built an empire through his own genius and tireless work." Cross paced in front of the jury box like a predator stalking his prey. "The evidence will show that Mrs. Sterling's primary activities during this marriage consisted of attending charity galas, spending enormous sums on so-called philanthropic activities, and enjoying the fruits of my client's labor without contributing anything meaningful in return. Now, facing the end of this marriage, she seeks to claim half of everything my client built with his own hands and brilliant mind. This is not justice. This is legalized theft." The opening was devastating in its simplicity. Cross painted Celeste as the epitome of the lazy, entitled wife who married for money and was now trying to steal what she had never earned. He presented financial records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on charity events, expensive dinners, and what he characterized as frivolous pursuits. The prenuptial agreement was displayed on large screens throughout the courtroom, a document that clearly limited Celeste to $50,000 in the event of divorce. "My client was generous enough to provide for her basic needs," Cross continued, "but he was wise enough to protect the fruits of his own labor from exactly the kind of predatory behavior we see here today." When it came time for Celeste's attorney to present her opening statement, the difference in resources was painfully obvious. Her lawyer, a decent man named Robert Chen, who specialized in family law, seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was facing. His opening was competent but uninspiring, focusing on the length of the marriage and the sacrifices Celeste had made as a supportive wife. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that this was going to be a massacre. The first day of testimony was a parade of character assassination. Richard took the stand with the practiced ease of someone who had testified before Congress and addressed shareholder meetings worth billions of dollars. He spoke eloquently about his journey from a middle-class background to becoming one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. He described the countless 18-hour days, the sleepless nights, the risks he had taken with his own money and reputation. "I built Sterling Industries from nothing," he testified, his voice carrying just the right mix of pride and humility. "Every breakthrough, every innovation, every strategic decision that led to our success came from my vision and my work." When Cross asked about Celeste's role in his success, Richard's tone became noticeably cooler. "My wife was supportive in the way that wives are expected to be supportive," he said, as if he were discussing the weather. "She attended company events when required, made pleasant conversation with clients and investors, and maintained our household. But she had no involvement in the actual business operations, no understanding of the technology we were developing, and no input into the strategic decisions that drove our growth." Cross introduced email after email showing Richard working late into the night, developing algorithms, negotiating deals, and making the crucial decisions that had built his empire. The narrative was compelling because it contained enough truth to be believable. Richard had indeed worked incredibly hard. He had indeed made sacrifices and taken risks. What the emails didn't show was the complete picture, but at this point in the trial, no one was looking for the complete picture. Throughout this devastating testimony, Celeste sat quietly at the defendant's table, taking notes in a small leather notebook. She didn't react when Richard described her as having no head for business. She didn't flinch when Cross characterized her as someone who had married for money and lifestyle rather than love. Her calm demeanor was interpreted by most observers as either admirable dignity in the face of defeat or the shell-shocked numbness of someone who knew she was beaten before she started. The media coverage that night was brutal. Cable news shows dissected every moment of the day's testimony. Legal experts unanimously agreed that Celeste's case was hopeless. Social media exploded with commentary about gold-digging wives and the importance of prenuptial agreements. The few voices that suggested the story might be more complicated were drowned out by the overwhelming narrative of a hard-working man being attacked by his ungrateful spouse. When the second day began, Cross continued his methodical destruction of Celeste's character. He called witnesses who testified about her spending on charity events, painting these expenditures as evidence of her frivolous nature. He brought in financial experts who demonstrated that every dollar Celeste had spent during the marriage had come from Richard's accounts. The implication was clear. She was a parasite who had contributed nothing while consuming everything. But then something shifted. When Cross finally finished his case and it came time for Celeste's defense, she surprised everyone by asking to represent herself for the remainder of the trial. Judge Monroe was skeptical. It's almost always a mistake for non-lawyers to represent themselves in complex litigation, but Celeste insisted she was qualified to handle her own defense. The judge reluctantly agreed, and suddenly the woman who had been sitting quietly for 2 days taking notes stood up and transformed into someone entirely different. "Your Honor," Celeste began, her voice clear and confident, "I'd like to start by correcting some misconceptions that have been presented to this court." She moved with the practiced ease of someone completely comfortable in a courtroom, and her tone carried an authority that hadn't been present when her previous attorney was speaking. "My name is Celeste Washington Sterling, and I am a graduate of Harvard Law School, where I graduated magna cum laude and served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review." A murmur went through the courtroom. This was the first time anyone had mentioned that Celeste was a lawyer. Richard's confident expression began to show the first cracks of uncertainty. 15 years ago, I was an associate at Morrison, Bradley and Associates, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in the country. I was on track to make partner before the age of 30, with a starting salary that would have exceeded $300,000. I gave up that career, not because I lacked ambition or intelligence, but because the man I loved asked me to help him build something extraordinary. Celeste began producing documents from her briefcase, not the scattered papers of a desperate defendant, but organized exhibits that had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. "These are emails from Richard Sterling to me, dated from 2009 to 2012. the crucial early years of Sterling Industries. I'd like to read just a few excerpts if the court will indulge me. She cleared her throat and began reading in Richard's own words. Celeste, I don't know what I would do without your legal expertise. The contract you drafted for the Henderson deal saved us from what could have been a company-ending lawsuit. Another email. Your analysis of the patent situation was brilliant. You've potentially saved us millions in licensing fees. And another. The investors were incredibly impressed with the legal framework you've established. Johnson said he's never seen a startup with such sophisticated intellectual property protection. The courtroom was completely silent now. These weren't the words of a man whose wife contributed nothing to his business. These were the grateful acknowledgments of someone whose success depended heavily on his wife's professional expertise. Your Honor, I didn't just make pleasant conversation at company events. For the first 5 years of Sterling Industries, I served as the company's legal counsel, chief contract negotiator, and intellectual property strategist. I worked 80-hour weeks alongside my husband, not because I was paid to do so, but because I believed in what we were building together. Celeste's voice carried the weight of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. She produced financial documents that showed her strategic decisions had saved Sterling Industries over $50 million in potential legal costs and had secured patents worth over $1 billion in current market value. Expert witnesses she had arranged to testify confirmed that her legal work had been instrumental in establishing the intellectual property portfolio that formed the foundation of Richard's current wealth. But Celeste was just getting started. From her briefcase, she produced bank statements and investment records that told a story no one in the courtroom was expecting. While my husband built his public empire, I was building something of my own. Using my maiden name and inheritance from my grandmother, I began making strategic investments in technology startups. My investment portfolio, completely separate from any marital assets, is currently valued at approximately $500 million. The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible. Richard's face had gone pale. Cross was frantically whispering to his associates, clearly having been caught completely off guard. The so-called frivolous spending on charity that has been presented as evidence of my gold-digging nature was actually funded entirely through profits from my own investments. The legal aid clinic that has served over 2,000 low-income families, the scholarship program that has sent 50 young women to law school, the domestic violence shelter that has housed and protected hundreds of women, all of it funded with my money, not his. Celeste moved to a projection screen and began displaying evidence of her charitable work with the efficiency of a seasoned litigator. These weren't vanity projects or society wife activities. They were substantial programs that had made real differences in thousands of lives. The woman who had been portrayed as a shallow gold digger was revealed to be a serious philanthropist who had been quietly changing lives while everyone assumed she was just spending her husband's money. But, Your Honor, there's something else this court needs to know, something that goes to the very heart of Sterling Industries' success. Celeste's voice took on an even more serious tone. The breakthrough algorithm that became the foundation of Sterling Industries, the technology that generated the first $100 million in revenue and established the company as a major player in the industry, was actually my creation. The courtroom erupted in whispers and exclamations. Judge Monroe had to gavel for order. Richard looked like he had been punched in the stomach. During my final year at Harvard Law School, I was completing a dual degree program that included advanced computer science coursework. My thesis project was the development of a data analysis algorithm that could identify patterns in user behavior with unprecedented accuracy. I completed this work in 2008, a full year before I met Richard Sterling. I have the original code, timestamped and witnessed by my professors, as well as the university records that document my work. Celeste produced a thick folder of documentation that included her original thesis, professor evaluations, and university records. When Richard and I began dating, I shared this algorithm with him as a gesture of trust and love. I never imagined he would use it as the foundation of a billion-dollar company while giving me no credit for my contribution. The revelation was staggering. The algorithm that had made Richard Sterling famous and wealthy wasn't his creation at all. It was the intellectual property of the woman he was now trying to limit to $50,000 in their divorce. The genius behind Sterling Industries had been sitting at the defendant's table all along, quietly taking notes while being portrayed as a parasite. Cross objected frantically, but the documentation was overwhelming. University professors were prepared to testify about Celeste's groundbreaking work. The original code was available for expert analysis. The timeline was clear and undeniable. The foundation of Sterling Industries' success belonged to Celeste Washington, not Richard Sterling. As the full scope of the deception became clear, the dynamics in the courtroom shifted completely. The reporters who had come expecting to witness the destruction of a gold-digging wife were now scrambling to rewrite their stories about one of the most dramatic reversals in legal history. The woman everyone had underestimated had just revealed herself to be not only Richard's intellectual equal, but quite possibly his superior. Judge Monroe called for a recess to allow the court to process the extraordinary evidence that had been presented. When proceedings resumed, her demeanor had changed completely. She was no longer presiding over a simple divorce case. She was now dealing with what appeared to be a massive fraud that had been perpetuated for over a decade. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Monroe said, her voice carrying a judicial authority that made it clear the trial had taken a very serious turn. "You have testified under oath that you were solely responsible for the creation and development of Sterling Industries. In light of the evidence presented by your wife, do you wish to revise that testimony?" Richard's legal team huddled frantically, but the evidence was overwhelming. Security camera footage from Harvard's computer science building showed Celeste working on the algorithm. Email records demonstrated that she had shared the completed code with Richard. University officials were prepared to testify about her groundbreaking work. There was no credible way to deny what had been revealed. The final hours of the trial were a complete reversal of everything that had come before. Instead of a gold-digging wife trying to steal from her hard-working husband, the case was now about a brilliant woman whose contributions had been stolen and whose character had been systematically destroyed in an attempt to prevent her from claiming what was rightfully hers. Judge Monroe's ruling was swift and decisive. Not only was the prenuptial agreement invalidated due to fraud and misrepresentation, but Celeste was awarded 60% of Sterling Industries as the rightful creator of the technology that had made the company's success possible. Richard was ordered to pay $50 million in damages for concealing marital assets and attempting to defraud the court. Most dramatically, Celeste was granted immediate control of her share of the company, giving her the power to influence major business decisions going forward. As they left the courthouse, the contrast from just days before was remarkable. Richard, who had entered the trial as a confident billionaire surrounded by legal firepower, now walked alone, his legal team having largely abandoned him once the fraud became apparent. Federal prosecutors were already indicating their interest in investigating potential criminal charges related to intellectual property theft and corporate fraud. Celeste, meanwhile, found herself fielding calls from major corporations eager to bring someone of her obvious talents into their leadership teams. Before she had even reached her car, she had received preliminary job offers from 6 Fortune 500 companies, including one position that would have made her one of the highest-paid legal executives in the country. 6 months later, Celeste's transformation was complete. She had launched her own legal technology company, leveraging her expertise in both law and computer science to create innovative solutions for complex corporate challenges. The company was valued at over $100 million within its first year of operation. Her scholarship program had expanded to help 500 students annually, and her legal aid clinic had become a model that was being replicated in cities across the country. Richard's story took a very different trajectory. Sterling Industries, deprived of Celeste's strategic thinking and legal expertise, struggled to maintain its competitive edge. The company's value dropped by 30% as investors lost confidence in leadership that had been built on a lie. Federal investigations into corporate fraud created additional uncertainty that made it difficult to attract new talent or secure major contracts. The case became a landmark in family law, studied in law schools as an example of how assumptions about gender, race, and contribution can blind people to the truth. Legal experts wrote extensively about the dangers of accepting surface narratives without investigating the underlying facts. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing and crediting the contributions of all parties in any relationship or business partnership. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Celeste was invited to speak at a conference for young black women entering the legal profession. Standing at the podium in a ballroom filled with ambitious young attorneys, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "They will underestimate you," she told the audience, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the experience she was describing. "They will dismiss your contributions, minimize your expertise, and try to convince the world that you are less capable than you actually are. They will take credit for your work, profit from your ideas, and then act surprised when you demand recognition for what you have created." She paused, looking out at the faces of women who were just beginning their own professional journeys. "But here's what I want you to remember. Your worth is not determined by their recognition. Your value is not diminished by their attempts to minimize it. Your intelligence is not reduced by their failure to acknowledge it. You have the power to build your own empire, create your own success, and define your own legacy." The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but more importantly, the message resonated far beyond that ballroom. In a world where talent and contribution are often overlooked because they don't fit expected narratives, Celeste Washington's story became a reminder that the most powerful person in the room might be the one everyone assumes is powerless. The courtroom gasps that day weren't just about the shock of unexpected evidence or dramatic legal reversals. They were about the recognition that sometimes the person we underestimate is exactly the person who built the very foundation we're standing on. They were about the realization that strength often hides behind quiet dignity, that brilliance doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, and that justice, when it finally arrives, can be more powerful and more complete than anyone imagined possible. In the end, Celeste Washington didn't just win her divorce case, she reclaimed her story, her contributions, and her rightful place as one of the most innovative legal and technological minds of her generation. The woman who walked into that courtroom carrying a worn briefcase walked out carrying something far more valuable: the recognition that she had always been the genius behind the empire, and now the world finally knew it too.